Let's first ask the first one. If I loved God, what would I do? If I was focused on developing emotionally. Laura?
I would respect his laws.
How can you respect laws you don't even know?
Oh well, I'd have a desire to know how God's laws are in operation in order his loving laws.
So how do you know them? How do you know?
Well, first, if I desire them, I'd want to be in harmony with the way God feels about me and others and the environment.
But how do you know?
I'd have to emotion.
You'd have to.
Well, I'd have to experiment with the laws in order to
Okay.
gain an
You'd have to experiment with them and discover information about them, wouldn't you?
So it can be a personal experience and not just something I've read.
Okay, so if you loved God, if you decided you wanted to love God, one of the first things you'd be trying to do is to discover God, discover God's nature, God's personality, God's character, all of these things about God. How do you do that? You do that by studying the concept of God from an emotional perspective. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, many of us never done that, right? I know, but Paul's done it. I can feel Paul's done that. Very few people in this auditorium at the moment have done it. I know Paul has because I can feel his love for God. I can feel his desire to know God. It's very strong in him, right? But most of us sort of leave God on the back burner if you think about it. We do, don't we? If we're honest with ourselves, we don't think about loving God, we think about God loving us. But that's a bit selfish, isn't it? Like, how do you develop a relationship where it's all one-sided, where they have to love you but you don't have to do anything? Does that kind of relationship really work? Right? So if you imagine you married, and the things you said during your marriage were, I would like you to love me, but I don't have to love you. Now, would that come across pretty romantic in the process of your wedding ceremony? You know, like, I don't have to love you, but you've got to love me. And that's all I'm interested in. So what's that called? There's a word for that. Narcissism, selfishness. Yeah. So if we really wanted to have a relationship with God, wouldn't we want to discover God? Okay, so if I loved God, one of the first things I'd want to do is discover God's nature, isn't it? You can't love someone you don't know, right? And as Laurie pointed out, the way you do that is by experimenting with your relationship with God. That's how you do that. If you think about how you do it with a person, how do you do it? You experiment with a relationship with them, don't you? When you first see a person, you go, I would really like to get to know that person. What do? You take action and spend time with that person. You try to get to know that person. You try to listen to that person about how they have lived their life, their history, and all these other things. This is the thing you try to do, isn't it? So why don't you do that with God? Why don't you try, at least attempt to do that with God? Now, a lot of people then say, well, but, God's not the same as a relationship with a person. And I say, no, God's an easier relationship than a relationship with a person. God is totally willing and desirous of sharing all that information with you about herself. And the only thing stopping you from absorbing that information about her is you, your unwillingness to know her, your unwillingness to discover. She's totally open to letting you know everything possible about her nature, her character, her laws, her abilities, her power, all these things that we often talk about but we don't know much about because we haven't done anything about trying to discover God's nature for ourselves personally. Right? If I was understanding my emotional self and I loved God, I would be desiring this with my feelings. I'd be going, wow, this is something that I need to focus a bit of my time on. Like, Jesus is saying to me that the most important relationship that I'm ever going to develop is my relationship with God. And yet, how many times do I ask about my physical relationships and nothing about my relationship with God. If we're honest with ourselves, almost every single question that we ask is generally not about God. But that's the primary relationship. Once we have that as the primary relationship, every single question probably will firstly be about God. And then about our relationships with people and our partner and our children and all those other things. Does that make sense? Can you see how even our day-to-day life is illustrating that we don't really yet have a strong desire to love God, to actually know God, to feel God? Because most of the time, the questions we're asking ourselves are not about God at all. They're about everything else other than God. We of course, have the frequently asked questions channel now, right? We get lots and lots of emails in about, questions about all sorts of things. Emotions, we got something like 200 or so questions. We've actually filtered out a lot of doubling up and all those kind of things. And in the end, we've got a couple of hundred more questions that we want to answer about emotions. If I went through recently all of the lists of things that people have asked about. And there's only 13 questions about God. Now, this is from a group of people who say that they want to place God as their first relationship. And there's only 13 questions about God. We have over 2,500 questions and 13 of them about God. And you know what that says to me? We don't really want to know about God. We want God to know about us. And trust me, God already does. That's the sad thing. God already knows about you. It's you who don't know about God yet. That's the problem. That's the reason why we're closed to this and closed to that and closed to the reception of love. A lot of times it's because we don't really truly have a desire to know the person who is actually giving us the love. Yeah. Mary?
So I could add to your list of what I would do if I loved God.
Sure.
I would be willing to open my heart to God,
Yes.
to expose who I am to God without trying to censor that and overcome any fear I have of doing that, because I wanted to give my feelings to God.
So let's be more specific about it. It's really opening my heart. So it's opening my heart in two ways. One way is to give my feelings. And what's the other way?
To receive God's feelings.
To receive God's feelings.
And I do that when I love. When I love, I open my heart to give and receive simultaneously. That's an expression of love.
Exactly.
It's not, I want to give love or receive love as two separate things. When love is in my heart, it opens my heart towards that person or towards God, and then I want to give and receive simultaneously.
Correct. Now, God is not injured in love. You've heard me say this many, many times. God's not injured in love. The average person on the planet is injured in love. So what is more complicated? Trying to resolve your relationship with people on earth, or trying to resolve your relationship with God? Well, of course, it's the people on earth that are more complicated, isn't it? Because we've got our own injuries and their injuries to work our way through. With God, we've only got our own injuries to work our way through. And so it's less complicated to have a relationship with God than it is to have a relationship with any other being. So it makes sense to start with your relationship with God, not for it to be the one that you ask about at the end or the last, but rather to be the one you focus on first. All right? Can you see that? Yeah, Matt?
It's probably a bit of an open-ended question, but why is it that we all on earth just want to live in denial almost of God's existence? In this?
Well, because we've got so many emotions about it. We've got so many emotions locked up about God's existence. So many fears, so many denials, So much untruth is perpetrated, both in the name of God erroneously, but also so much untruth in terms of what is God's nature, what is God's character, all of those things. We hardly know anything. Most people don't want to know God because they feel that it's impossible to know God. And when you feel something's impossible, you don't bother trying. You just don't. So the majority of people on this planet have no faith that God exists, and no faith that even if God does exist, that they personally can ever know God. And so they don't bother trying. If you think about the last 6 years or so, for many of you that you've been associated with Divine Truth, and you reflect back that you've very rarely asked questions about God and God's nature, right? Like I've received hardly any questions from you about God or God's nature. And then you think about why that's the case. What would you feel is the case? What do you feel is the reason why that's the case? Laura?
I think it ties into what we spoke about yesterday with not forgiving our parents or still feeling we need to repent for our parents. So it's linked with the feelings that we have with our parents. We put that on, people put that on God and still view that relationship as the same.
Yes. So shall we say in a summary of that, shall we say we're imposing our relationship with our parents upon God? We're basically believing God is the same as our parents. So that is a problem, isn't it?
And if we have fear of our parents and feel unsafe, which we all did feel unsafe, then we feel unsafe to open our heart to God for the same fears.
Good. So that's one of their main problems. How honest are we about our relationship with our parents, generally? Most people are not very honest at all, you know. And if you can't be honest about your relationship with your parents, how are you ever going to break down the blockage between you and God if one of the major blockages is your relationship with your parents? It's not going to be possible. So that is a problem. Yep. Can you see that understanding your emotional self requires that you start to feel about, okay, I haven't really been very emotional with God. I haven't really wanted this relationship with God. I haven't really desired it. I haven't really longed for it. So how can I really expect to enter and know everything God knows? I can't. None of that's possible unless I really desire this relationship with God. And yet when it comes to my relationship with my partner, how much words, energy, time, emotion gets expended there trying to get to know them in comparison? Huge amounts, right? And how many questions have I asked about all sorts of things? My own emotional condition, my own emotional state, my own, truths about, external truths about the universe. Long lists of them. I've had many conversations with many of you where I've answered 50 questions in a row about those kind of things, right? And yet not one question about God. And to me that tells us something. That tells me something anyway. It tells me that most of us are still pretty blocked towards God. Now, if you're fairly blocked towards God, how are you going to be open to receiving God's love? It's going to be hard. And this is why many of us are finding it hard. Because we're not open to that relationship for whatever reasons. Like it would be wise, you would think, wouldn't it? It'd be wise to focus on why you're not open to that relationship as one of the first things you address. That would be where wisdom would dictate where you would spend your time. Focus first on the reason why you haven't got a relationship with God. That'll help you sort out a lot of other problems in the process. Right? Okay.